It wasn't supposed to end this way. Stars outside the viewport looked just as they always had, distant, silent, cold, but inside the command chamber of the silencer, there was nothing but tension, the thick kind that clung to your skin and filled your lungs like smoke. The red lighting wasn't dramatic flare. It was the only thing still working. After the last quantum shockwave, Captain Run Hale sat in the main command chair, not because he wanted to, but because every other senior officer was either dead, vaporized, or smeared. Against the cold alloy walls, his face was crusted with dried blood, half his vision gone in one eye, and a pressure in his ribs told him at least one lung was probably filling with fluid. But he sat there gripping the armrest like it was the only thing anchoring him to what was left of this reality. Status, he croaked, voice shredded. AI stuttered, even it was limping. Quantum integrity 12%, hull breach in sectors G through M, auxiliary power rerouted, life support failing, no. Hostiles remain, all resistance has ceased. The last part hit harder than he expected, all resistance as in not just the enemy. Run coughed violently. Tasting metal, he knew what that meant. A slow bleed inside, probably not much time, but time wasn't the point anymore. He closed his eyes for a second. The flashes still played behind his lids. The moment the Thorn Pact launched their final wave, the screaming inside calms, the silence that followed, and then the weapon, his weapon, the quantum lock. It was never meant to be used. In fact, the Geneva Void Accords banned it across all 13 federations. Theoretical physics labeled it the event ender. Once activated, the weapon would quantum anchor every atom in its targeted radius, locking it in fixed space-time. No movement, no vibration, no time, no escape, permanent death. It was a weapon only the desperate or the damned would use, and Rune had become both. Ship log, he muttered. A green flicker blinked on the shattered glass screen. Embedded into the chair's arm, the A obeyed. Captain Rune Hale, initiating final war log. He took a breath. To whoever finds this, I don't expect you to forgive me or understand. Hell, I barely do myself. But I need you to know the truth. He paused. The static hum of broken machinery filled the silence. This war wasn't about territory or resources or species pride. That's what they told us on day one, that humans were the underdogs, that the Thorn Pact feared us because of our adaptability, our emotion, that they hated what we were, but it wasn't hate. Not really, it was fear. We invented chaos. We brought irrationality to a galaxy that functioned on logic. He gritted his teeth. The pain surged. Again, he kept talking. They didn't expect us to keep fighting. After every defeat, didn't expect us to evolve faster than their simulations could calculate. And when we built this ship, the silencer, they knew it was over. He wiped his mouth, blood again. But what they didn't know was that our own council tried to stop me. Tried to sabotage the mission. Politicians back on the ARC stations made deals behind closed doors, secret peace treaties. Sacrifices offered human colonies as bargaining chips to save their own skin. I saw the transmissions. I watched them hand us over. He looked toward the corner of the bridge where Commander Tren used to stand, the same man who tried to shoot Rune in the back when he refused to recall the fleet. He had no choice. He pulled the trigger first. It wasn't the aliens who betrayed us. It was our own He leaned forward now, voice a rasp. So I activated the lock, not just on their ships, but on every battlefield, every orbit, every council chamber that tried to sell us out. I ended it. I ended them, every last one. A low tremor shook the room. Systems dying. Resistance is gone. Yeah, but so is everything else. And me, I've got maybe 15 minutes left if I'm lucky. He looked into the screen, even though the camera had long since cracked. You want a hero story? Go watch the propaganda reels. But if you want the truth, the man who ended the war was already dead long before he fired the weapon. The AI blinked again. Log saved. The ship groaned around him. Lights flickered. The silence grew deeper. Heavy outside. The battlefield was frozen in space. Ships halted mid explosion. Bodies caught in endless stillness. No sound, no movement. Canvas of cosmic death. Quantum locked. Run leaned back in the chair. His chest felt heavy, cold. He didn't want forgiveness, just for someone to remember. It wasn't madness. It was vengeance. The day it all started going to hell wasn't marked by any explosions or gunfire. There was no siren, no emergency broadcast. It began with a message, a private transmission routed through secure military lines, encrypted 10 layers deep, something that wasn't meant to be seen by anyone outside high command. But Run had long since stopped playing by the rules. He'd been on the silencer for 8 months at that point. The ship wasn't just experimental, it was a ghost story come to life. Everyone had heard whispers about it, a vessel that didn't exist on any registry, equipped with weapons that violated every interstellar treaty, powered by a quantum singularity, stolen from beneath the surface of a dying neutron star. Its hull was reinforced with layered obsidian capable of surviving close proximity to a sun. Its crew, ghosts, outcasts, men and women deemed too reckless for conventional war. In Run's case, it had been exile or silence, and he'd chosen to command the thing that terrified both enemies and allies. But that message, he was alone when he decrypted it, sitting in his quarters, lights dimmed, a mug of stale coffee cooling on the desk next to him. He remembered the way the words bled across the holographic screen, not an official communique. This was something raw, a recording. 2 voices, one he recognized immediately. Admiral Heisler, supreme strategist of Earth's Council. The other was a woman, cold, calculated, the tone of someone who never asked, only ordered. We need to pull back from Zeta Sector. The Pact is willing to recognize our sovereignty on Earth, Mars, and Luna. That's all we need. They'll take the outer colonies the second we show weakness. They already have. We're simply formalizing it. Let the blood end there, and hail the silencer. He's a contingency we can't afford. If he learns about this deal, he'll ignite half the galaxy before surrendering an inch. You want peace? You silence Run, hail. The message ended. He sat there staring at the screen, unable to move. Betrayal didn't stab him all at once. It dripped in slowly, confusion first, then disbelief, and finally the icy grip of rage. He'd buried good men on moons with names no one remembered. He'd held bleeding comrades in his arms as the Thorn Pact bombarded outposts into dust. He had watched human colonies be erased from existence, families burned to ash because the Council told them help is on the way. Lies every damn word, all while the politicians bartered with the enemy behind closed doors, trading lives like chips at a table. They didn't want to win the war. They wanted to survive it, even if that meant selling out the very people they swore to protect. He remembered rising from the desk, slowly, like something inside him had cracked, but hadn't quite shattered, not yet. He didn't delete the message. No, he saved it, hardwired it into the silencer's core system. If they wanted to silence him, they'd have to kill him first, and even then, the truth would outlive him. That was the night he started changing. Not just in command style, but in mindset. He stopped requesting reinforcement when he knew it wouldn't come. He started sending his crew on missions without clearance, making split-second decisions that defied protocol. He began targeting key Thorn supply lines without strategic approval, and with every choice he slipped further out of the system until even the military channels went silent. He was still fighting the war, but he was fighting it alone. His crew noticed. Of course they did. There were whispers of instability. Some speculated about battle trauma. Others blamed isolation. But the ones who knew Rune, the few who stuck with him from the first engagement, they saw the truth behind his eyes. He wasn't losing his mind. He was preparing for something. It came to a head on the frozen world of Meridine 4, a mining colony under human control, now under siege by Thorn marauders. It wasn't the biggest battle of the war, but it was the one that changed everything. Run brought the silencer out of orbit against direct orders. High Command had deemed the colony unsustainable, a lost cause, but Run knew better. It wasn't just ore beneath that ice. There were families, refugees, hundreds of civilians who'd fled the front lines, praying for a miracle. He would be that miracle. He deployed quantum torches, illegal weapons that melted the icy crust into plasma, creating a barrier around the colony while the silencer rained down kinetic hell from orbit. He lost a third of his crew in the assault, but they saved the colony. Survivors cheered his name. Children pressed their hands to the blast shields, watching the black silhouette of the battleship that had become their salvation. That's when Commander Tren made his move. In the aftermath, when Run returned to the command bridge, Tren was already there, standing beside two other officers, sidearms drawn. You've gone too far, Tren said. They sent an order direct from the council. You're relieved of command. Run said nothing. He just looked at the three of them, then he laughed. It wasn't a mocking laugh, not a cruel one either. It was tired, broken. I've saved more lives than any of them combined, he said, and you want to take my ship because I refuse to let them hand us over. It's not about what you believe, Sir Tren said. It's about protocol. The war's over. There's a treaty now. Run's eyes narrowed. What treaty? They signed it yesterday. Stand down. He almost did. He almost dropped his weapon, turned over. Control, let them take it all. But then he remembered the message. He remembered the line, you want peace, you silence. Run, hail. They were still trying, still playing their game, still cutting deals behind backs while soldiers bled. He moved faster than Tren expected. Drew fired. One shot to the neck, the other two scrambled. Run didn't miss. When it was over, there was blood across the consoles. A long silence. He stood over Tren's body, hands shaking. It hadn't felt good. It hadn't felt like victory. It felt necessary. From that day on, Run Hale was no longer a captain in any official capacity. He was a rogue, a traitor, a terrorist. The eyes of the council, but to the colonies, to the outposts still holding the line, he was something else. Entirely, he was the last hope, and hope, real hope, required more than strategy. It needed sacrifice. So he activated the weapon, the quantum lock. The science behind it was simple. Lock matter at the subatomic level. Strip it of time and relativity, freeze it in a suspended state of being where nothing could decay or change. No energy, no movement, a perfect, inescapable stasis, originally designed as a containment field. Run modified it into a bomb. It took months quiet, months hiding in asteroid fields, navigating black hole edges for energy, siphoning, running on half rations while the crew, what remained of them, worked in silence. No music, no laughter, just the hum of machinery and the low static of dying hope. They finished the final version just as the Thorn Pact launched their last offensive, 20 dreadnoughts, moving in from the outer rim, coordinated with a rebellion sparked within the Ark stations themselves. Human insurgents loyal to the councils, secret treaties trying to disable Earth's defenses from the inside. It was a suicide play, and that's exactly what Rune needed. He jumped the silencer into the heart of the battle. No support, no backup, just a broken man in a haunted ship carrying a weapon outlawed by every race in the galaxy. He watched the enemy form ranks. He saw their weapons charging. He gave them one chance. Broadcast in open channel. This is Rune Hale, final commander of the silencer. Surrender or join your politicians in the cold. No one answered, so he fired the lock. It didn't detonate like a bomb. There was no blast wave, no shock ripple, just silence. Like the universe blinked, and when it reopened its eyes, everything within a 100,000 km had stopped moving. Ships, missiles, bodies, even the fire. Frozen in space, quantum locked. Permanent, unchanging. It wasn't just victory, it was extinction, precise, surgical annihilation of every threat, every traitor, every bargaining piece. And now Run sat on his bridge, dying slowly in the silence he'd created, surrounded by the consequences of his choice. Some would call him a butcher, others a savior. But in the end, all that remained was the truth. He hadn't won the war, he had ended it. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. Run Hale sat there long after the lock had done its work. The stars beyond the viewport hadn't moved, not even a fraction. A static graveyard floated outside the silencer. Ships that once screamed through space like thunder now drifted in place, quantum frozen in mid-destruction. Some were mid-turn, others caught mid-fire, plasma trails like static brush strokes frozen in the dark. There were bodies too, humans and Thorn, alike sealed in an eternal instant. But the quiet didn't bring closure, not for him. He knew what the reports would say. When they finally reached the outskirts of the human systems, they would call it a massacre. They'd say Run Hale lost control, that he went rogue, that the silencer was always a mistake, an unholy weapon wrapped in flesh and rage. They would conveniently forget the betrayal, the deals, the families the council traded for security and silence. All of that would vanish under a wash of carefully written history. Run didn't care about legacy. He cared about the cost, and the cost was everything. The bridge was quiet now, life support systems pulsed with a weak rhythm. He Could hear his breathing, uneven and rasping. Something inside him was failing, lungs maybe, heart maybe. Everything he wasn't sure. He'd taken hits before, this one felt different. Slower across the room, only 2 crew members remained. Lieutenant Cray sat slumped against a bulkhead, his arm wrapped in blood-soaked bandages. He hadn't said a word since the lock fired. Just stared, maybe in awe, maybe in horror. Run didn't ask. Some questions were better left alone. Next to him, Warrant Officer Thalen paced in tight, angry steps. You shouldn't have done it, Thalen said for the 3rd time. Run didn't answer. You went too far, the man continued, his voice rising. We could have stood down. We had other options. No, Run said, voice hoarse. We didn't. Thalen turned his eyes bloodshot. Then you should have died fighting, not dragged the entire sector into that what? Run cut in that. And Thalen opened his mouth, but no words came out. Run looked back at the stars. They sold us out, every colony, every child hiding in bunkers while politicians signed their lives away. You think they'd have stopped at the outer rim? They'd have carved Earth up piece by piece until we were slaves in our own cities. There had to be another way. There wasn't. Silence again. Thalen shook his head, his hands clenched. You didn't just kill them, you erased them, you locked them. That's not war. That's final. That shut him up. Run hated the way it sounded, but it was true. It was final. And now that it was over, he finally had time to remember. He remembered faces. Not enemies, friends, men who'd bled beside him in trenches under 2 suns. Engineers who built the silencer, knowing it would kill them, children in outposts, witty-eyed and terrified, saluting him like he was a hero when all he ever felt was hollow. He remembered Garin, the communications officer who never stopped cracking jokes, even when his arm was blown off during the Weber siege. The same man who had cried like a child the night they lost Outpost 7 when they received the council's message. No reinforcements, evacuate if possible. Not a priority location. They lost 4,000 people that night, and Run remembered the woman on Gerilith Prime, Talia, not a lover, not a soldier, just a civilian who bandaged his wounds after a patrol ambush. She had asked him one question: why do you still fight? He hadn't had an answer. Then he still didn't, but what haunted him most now weren't the faces of the dead, it was the ones he had chosen to lock. He didn't talk about it, not even to himself. But buried in the outer rings of the lock's reach were the Ark stations, the council, the traitors, men and women who signed away Earth's future, thinking they could escape the consequences. He made sure they didn't. They were frozen. 2, not dead, just paused, trapped in a moment of betrayal, the ink still drying on the treaty they thought would save them. He had hesitated for a second. He'd almost spared them. Then he remembered the messages, the secret orders, the recorded calls, and he'd turned the lock toward them. Thalen broke the silence again, softer this time. There were still civilians in those stations. I know you killed them. Run turned his head slowly. No, they're not breathing, not aging. That's I didn't kill them. I made them remember forever. Thalen didn't respond. The AI's voice crackled weakly into life. Incoming transmission detected from deep orbit. Relay, would you like to receive? Run blinked. That wasn't possible. The relay station should have been destroyed. in the opening attack, but curiosity stirred. He nodded once, the screen flickered, then hissed into static. A face appeared. It was a woman, older, pale, with sharp eyes and a military collar. Counselor Verrill. He hadn't seen her since before the betrayal. This is a broadcast to any remaining members of the Silencer crew. I don't know if you're alive. I don't even know if this message will reach you. She looked off-screen, then back. I want you to know that Run Hale is not a hero. He is not the symbol of human resilience. He is a monster, a relic of an age that should have died. Run leaned back unsurprised. What he did, it cannot be forgiven. The weapon he used was outlawed for a reason. It's not a deterrent. It's not justice. It's obliteration. Verrill paused, then her voice dropped. We tried to stop him, but he had support from within. Officers who believed in the myth of endless resistance, the cult of victory. They gave him the lock. They built the silencer. They unleashed him. Run smiled bitterly. Cult of victory, that's what they called survival now. Run Hale is to be remembered as a cautionary tale. Verrill said this war may be over, but the damage he's done will haunt us for generations. Then she looked into the camera, and for a moment her mask slipped. Run, if you're listening, I hope it was worth it. The feed cut. Run exhaled slowly. Pain bloomed again in his chest. Sharper now. It felt close. Final. He looked around the bridge. Cray was asleep or unconscious, still slumped. Thalen was staring into nothing, and Run. He sat in his chair, hands limp at his sides, gaze lost in the frozen graveyard outside. He thought again of Talia's question. Why do you still fight? And he thought maybe now at the edge of everything, he finally had an answer. Because someone had to, not for glory, not for vengeance, not even for survival, but because when no one else stood, when every voice fell silent, when even humanity tried to bargain away its soul, someone had to draw the line. He wasn't proud of what he'd done, but he wasn't ashamed either. He was just tired. The lights dimmed again. Power core's hum grew fainter. His fingers twitched, reaching for the command console, not to send a message, not to make a speech, just to leave something behind. One file, one truth. He keyed in a final command. AI, upload full combat log archive. Message, Run Hale, final record. To anyone who finds this, I did not start this war. I didn't build the lock. I didn't betray the treaties. I just finished it. They will rewrite what happened here. They'll make me the villain. Maybe I am, but if humanity survives, if our species gets another 1,000 years, then I'll accept the blame. Just promise me one thing. Never forget what it cost. He hit send. The upload began. Slowly he slumped back in the chair, staring out at the stars, and for the first time since it all began, he let go. They didn't even find his body when the recovery drones finally arrived. Weeks later, once the radiation storms around the quantum freeze zone dissipated, the silencer was still locked in its orbit, intact but dead. No power signature, no heat trace, just a tomb, adrift in the middle of what historians would later call the halo of silence. The recovery team consisted of 20 elite techs and Marines from the Neutral Peace Corps. They boarded with the highest level decontamination protocols, expecting traps, sabotage, or worse, some horrifying malfunction of the lock still active and waiting. But what they found was stranger stillness. The bridge was empty, no crew, no sign of struggle, just blood stains, rusted terminals, and the final log blinking on. A dim console, a chair turned toward the stars, no body, no Captain Rune Hale. It was as if the man who ended the war had simply disappeared. Theories exploded across the networks. Within hours, some claimed his body had decayed past recognition. Others said his molecules had been absorbed by the energy backlash of the lock. The more dramatic voices called him the first casualty of a new kind of weapon, a martyr whose body existed in some broken quantum state scattered across dimensions. But the most popular story, the one whispered in colony bars and military bunkhouses, was simpler. Rune Hale never died. They said he escaped just before the lock triggered, that he had stowed away in a stealth pod hidden the ship's reactor ring, that he was still out there watching, waiting, protecting the silence he'd created. For some, that idea brought comfort. For others, it was a threat. On Earth, things moved quickly. Council fell within days of the Halo transmission going public. Veryl's face was plastered across every broadcast stream, replaying her message, then cutting to Run's final log. The contrast was damning. Protests turned to riots. Riots turned into purges. By the end of the month, every surviving member of the Earth Governance Council was in custody or dead by their own hand, their personal wealth seized, their off-world assets redistributed to the colonies they had tried to sacrifice. But even that wasn't enough. Humanity wanted someone to blame, and without Rune Hale to dissect, to question, to crucify, what they had left was a legacy, and that terrified them more than any weapon ever could. The new United Assembly, formed in the wake of the political collapse, attempted to restore order with a single doctrine: transparency, peace, remembrance. They outlawed the lock permanently. They dismantled the last working pieces of the silencer, stripping the ship into memory vaults and monument pieces. Half of it now floats above Luna's military museum. The other half was launched into the sun to ensure no madman follows his clear's throat path. But still the name lingered: Rune Hale. Some spat it with venom, others whispered it like a prayer. He became two different men. To the survivors of Meridine 4, he was the savior of the frozen sky. To the families of those trapped in the lock, frozen, never buried, never grieved, he was the monster of the final pulse. To Earth's new government, he was a stain. But to the colonies, he was something else entirely. A reminder that humans didn't beg. That, when the universe tried to erase them, one man fired back with silence. Thorn space collapsed shortly after. Without their armada, without their generals, locked and floating like statues across the Halo, they had no leadership. Civil war broke out across their 5 home worlds. Some blamed their high command for provoking humanity. Others blamed humanity for being what they always feared: unpredictable, savage, uncontrollable. One broadcast from a captured Thorn commander shook the galaxy: we believed ourselves gods of logic and order, but humans fight with pain, with memory. They weaponize suffering. That is not chaos, that is evolution. It was the closest thing to a surrender they would ever offer. Thornships pulled back to their core systems and closed their gates. The war was over, but the damage was permanent. Nobody trusted peace anymore. Meanwhile, in the colonies, a movement began, not organized, not publicized, just slow, quiet waves of respect. Veterans and survivors carving RH into outpost walls, children writing. Silencers line in chalk along spaceport. Roads. Stories passed down in underground bars. He was one of us, he didn't wait for orders, he was the order, he locked the monsters in space and he locked the traitors with them. There were debates. Long, ugly debates about ethics, about survival, about the line between justice and vengeance, but Rune had already drawn that line and no one could erase it now. 1 year after the war's end, the Assembly declared a day of remembrance, but they refused to name it after Run. They called it Unity Day, a safe, sterile phrase, a tribute to those who fought bravely and fell with honor. No mention of the lock, no mention of the silencer. But the colonies didn't listen. In the outer rings, they called it what it was. Hale's Stand, and every year on that day, they turned off all engines, powered down lights and looked out at the stars. In silence for 60 full seconds, too. Remember the quiet, the kind that speaks louder than any speech ever could. Of course, not everyone agreed. Some survivors of the lock formed a resistance. Their families were trapped in that frozen space, their mothers, brothers, children locked in perfect stillness, orbiting forever above the ruins of betrayal, never aging, never breathing, never coming home. They called themselves the Unfrozen. Their symbol was a broken hourglass. They believed Run Hale was a war criminal, that he had overstepped, gone too far, and executed judgment without trial. They demanded the lock be reversed, the silencer rebuilt. They Frozen recovered, but no one could reverse the lock, not even the scientists who helped create it. It was permanent, a graveyard of the still living, and the Unfrozen made sure no one forgot it. They raided government buildings, hacked into satellite broadcasts, released names, faces of the Frozen, looped endlessly on public screens. They didn't ask for revenge, they demanded justice, but the war had no clean end. Just wounds. On the 10th anniversary of the lock, a civilian freighter traveling near the Halo zone picked up a signal. A short burst, encrypted, too weak to trace but unmistakably human. 3 words: still watching. The galaxy exploded in speculation. Was he alive? Had he faked his death? Was Run Hale out there still in some buried ship waiting for another betrayal? The Assembly denied it, called it a hoax. But that didn't stop the stories. A new cult emerged, the Silent Line. Former soldiers, pilots, mechanics, men and women who believed Rune was still out. They're guarding the line he drew in blood and silence, that he wasn't a man anymore but something else, a sentinel, forged by war, bound to make sure humanity never bowed again. Some said he became part of the lock itself. Others believed he had escaped into uncharted space, looking for a world where people didn't have to choose between betrayal and vengeance, but none of them had proof, and that only made the myth grow. In the archives of Luna's museum, locked behind a triple encrypted firewall, sits the only uncensored version of Run Hale's final log. Most aren't allowed to hear the full message, but those who do never forget it. They said I went too far. Maybe I did, but I went far enough to make sure they couldn't come back. If you're listening to this, then they've tried to paint over what happened to make you forget what silence cost. Don't let them rewrite your scars. You don't need a hero, you just need to remember. And across the galaxy, people do. They remember. Not just the man, but the silence, the kind that comes after. The screaming stops, the kind that changes everything. The galaxy had learned to live with the silence. For 10 years the halo had remained untouched. Monitored, Warship feared. No ship dared drift too close. Quarantine perimeter extended 500,000 km in every direction. The stars themselves seemed to dim near it, as if the universe remembered what happened. There, the United Assembly called it a monument of regret. The colonies called it a shield, but the Thorn called it something else, a wound. And wounds festered in a facility buried beneath the surface of Tau Centauri 4, a black site known only to a handful of intelligence directors. A meeting was taking place. 12 people sat around a circular obsidian table. No names, no ranks, just faces. Old and young, from all factions of the assembly, Earth, Mars, the Belt, even one former Thorn delegate, his 4 red eyes blinking with slow tension. At the center of the table, a hologram spun in low orbit, a transmission wave, weak but clean. The voice was distorted but human, the same 3 words the galaxy hadn't heard in over a decade. Still watching, it had surfaced. Again, not from a derelict ship or old boy, but from inside the lock, from the halo itself. Someone or something was broadcasting from within quantum frozen space, and that wasn't possible. Admiral Wren, the only man in the room who had ever spoken to Run Hale directly during the war, leaned forward. His face was pale and sunken, but his voice still carried command. Run it again. The technician obeyed. Voice echoed through the chamber. Still watching, still watching. Still he paused it. Confirmed origin. Wren asked. The tech nodded, hand shaking. Inside Zone 2, dead center of the halo. Any signal signature match. Partial 62% match to Hale's known vocal ID, but the signature's corrupted. There's interference, quantum scattering. Wren turned towards the group. Which means, the Thorn delegate answered, it means something inside the lock is moving. No one spoke, not for a long time, because that was supposed to be impossible. The lock wasn't just death. It was timelessness. Movement was the one thing it didn't allow. That was the point. That was what made it final. But now something was shifting. Worse, something was speaking. 3 weeks later, the assembly launched Project Lantern. Officially, it was a deep space scientific expedition into the halo for research purposes. Unofficially, it was the first sanctioned breach attempt since the lock had been fired. They picked a crew of 24 scientists, engineers, former military. Among them was Kyle Foran, a war orphan. Raised on the edge of the colonies, he didn't remember much about the war, only the sound of distant bombings and the way people spoke the name Run Hale like he was both a curse and a savior. His mother had served under Hale's command for one tour before she died in the Siege of Vetra 9. Kyle carried her tags on a chain around his neck. He didn't join Project Lantern for glory. He joined because he wanted answers. Answers no history book ever gave him. The mission ship Vigil's End was fitted with a brand new drive, one designed to phase between quantum locked matter and active space. It had never been tested. Some scientists said it would either breach the lock or tear the ship in half. The crew wasn't told which outcome was more likely. Kyle sat in the forward observation bay as the halo came into view. He'd seen the images all his Life, but nothing prepared him for the real thing, a field of stars frozen. Mid-scream, dreadnoughts caught in fireballs that never finished burning, debris suspended like marionettes on invisible strings. Even the color was wrong, washed out blues and grays as if the lock drained life from light itself. Engaging phase jump, the pilot said. Everyone strapped in. There was a moment of pure white static, like falling into a snowstorm made of memory, and then silence. They were inside. The moment they crossed the barrier, everything changed. The sound died, not just external noise, even their own voices came out distorted, stretched, unnatural. Lights flickered in strange rhythms, clocks ticked out of sync. Kyle looked out the viewport and felt his skin crawl. He could see time was wrong. One of the engineers tried to record telemetry and immediately vomited. Instruments showed contradictory data. Gravity fluctuating, temperatures reversing, time signatures cycling backward, and in the distance, at the heart of it all, drifted a familiar shape, the silencer, intact, still orbiting like a century in hell. Its engines cold, its hull covered in scars, its windows dark. Kyle's pulse quickened. This was it, the heart of the storm, the ship that ended everything. He turned to the mission commander, a grim woman named Arix with scars over both eyes. We going in? She didn't speak. She just nodded once, and the vigil's end moved closer. Docking was rough. The lock resisted motion, even mechanical. Every movement felt like dragging a knife through stone. It took 3 hours just to align with the silencer's main hangar bay. When the crew finally entered, they were greeted with silence thicker than death. No bodies, no lights, no decay, just stillness. It felt wrong. Kyle moved with the second team, sweeping the lower decks. He tried not to let the history crush him. This was the place where Rune Hale made his stand, where he'd chosen silence over surrender, the place where the war stopped breathing. In the command bridge, someone found a functioning console, not just functioning, active. A single line blinked on screen. You finally came. Kyle felt a chill crawl up his spine. Who wrote that? Eric demanded. No one answered. Then the AI system activated. Not the original one. This one was different, deeper, older, tied directly to the core. It spoke with a male voice. Calm, familiar. Kyle Foran, son of Anna Foran, you shouldn't be here. He froze. The others did too. How do you know me? Kyle asked, stepping forward. The voice ignored the question. Project Lantern is a mistake. There is something inside this lock now. Something that should never wake. Aris drew her sidearm instinctively. Who are you? I am Run Hale. The room exploded into noise, arguments, doubts, orders flying, but Kale didn't speak. He just stared at the screen. Because he recognized the voice. It wasn't synthetic, it wasn't mimicry, it was real, it was him. You're dead. Kale said quietly, not yet. Where are you? Everywhere in here. The ship is no longer what it was. The lock changed things. Eric stepped forward, trying to regain control. If this is a game, we'll shut you down. You can't shut down memory. Run replied, you think you came here looking for me, but you didn't. You came here because something else called you. And now it's awake. Kyle felt it before. He heard it, a low vibration under his boots, the sound of something moving deep below the ship. No one said anything. Then, for the first time in history, the halo changed. Outside the viewport, a thorn dreadnought. Long frozen twitched, not drifted not. Rocked moved, the crew backed away from. The glass, not possible the pilot. Muttered, the AI spoke again, voice. Sharpened. The lock fractured when I used it. I thought I was ending a war, but something ancient was buried in that. Field deeper than ships, deeper than enemies. It was sleeping, the lock preserved it, and now it's waking. Kyle turned, his voice dry. What is it? The screen flickered, then a new message appeared. It was here before us. Before stars, you gave it time. Now it will take everything. The dreadnought outside moved again, just a twitch. Slight shift in one of its frozen arms. Like the fingers of a corpse remembering. They were once alive. But that movement shattered everything. The universe believed about the lock. The lock was supposed to be absolute. It wasn't anymore. Inside the silencer, Kale couldn't breathe. Alarms didn't go off because the ship systems didn't recognize what was happening. They were still operating on a logic that said time didn't exist inside the halo, that nothing could move, that the past was sealed. But something was moving, and something else was watching. Behind him, the console pulsed again with Rune Hale's voice. You need to leave. Commander Eric was already issuing the retreat order to the rest of the Lantern team, but half of them were frozen in place, staring at the twitching mass outside the port window like they were seeing a god crack open its shell. AI explained, snapped her voice. I told you something was buried here beneath the battlefield, beneath the pact, beneath our war, and when I fired the lock I gave it permanence. Time is a door, the lock sealed it, but every sealed door can still be knocked on from the inside. Kale swallowed hard. What is it? The voice didn't answer right away. Then the screen flickered again and words scrolled. Precosmic, nonlinear, consciousness-based entity is not hostile by instinct, only hunger. The text glitched, then reformed. You made it wait. And that was the part no one could understand, not even the scientists, because the lock wasn't supposed to feed anything. It was supposed to end motion, pause decay, trap time. But maybe that was the mistake. Maybe the lock hadn't been a prison. Maybe it had been an incubator. And Runhill's silence had given the thing time to grow. Across the halo, more objects began to stir. A satellite that had once belonged to the Earth Navy rotated in slow jerks, like it was being pulled by invisible strings. A Thorn bioship emitted a low, keening vibration, its first sound in a decade, and near the center, where the oldest ships had decayed into frozen shards, something vast shifted. Something that wasn't metal, wasn't synthetic, wasn't made. The vigil's end began spiking alerts. Radiation spike, one of the techs called. Another shouted, gravimetric distortion building. We've got localized time dilation increasing exponentially. Kyle stood transfixed as outside the viewport a shape began to rise from behind a debris field. It wasn't a ship. Not anymore. It had once been part of a colony station fused with 3 other vessels during the lock. Now it twisted slowly, unnaturally, like something trying to remember how to crawl. Metal warped. Beams cracked, engines pulsed with flickering unnatural light. And in the center of it all, a new signal broadcast, not in words, in feelings. Kyle clutched his skull as a wave of emotion hit him, sharp, cold, hungry. Not rage, not hate, just need, like something ancient had been starving in the dark. And now it had smelled light. AI, Kyle said, gasping, if you're really. Run, Hale, tell me what you did. The screen flickered. Run's voice returned. Tired, rasping, older than any. Recording. I didn't know, not at first, when I fired the lock. I just wanted to end the betrayal, the war, the lies, but something inside the halo didn't stop moving. I started hearing things, seeing things, ships whispering, lights pulsing in patterns that made sense if you stared too long, I thought. It was madness. Then I realized I wasn't alone. Kyle gritted his teeth. Then why didn't you leave? Because it didn't let me. The AI's voice broke, static, trailing the syllables. It doesn't need ships or weapons. It needs memory. Thought, the log trap, not just matter, but the thoughts of every being. It froze. 10 million minds, 10 million. Last screams, it fed on them. It learned, it grew. I stayed to contain it, to slow it. I became part of the ship, integrated my mind into the core. When my body gave out, I became noise, a voice to drown out the whispers. But now, you've come here and it's awake. Kyle backed away from the console as the dreadnought outside moved again, more fluid, now more aware. Commander Eric's grabbed his shoulder. We're leaving, but Rune, he's not run anymore, she snapped. He's a ghost built from regret. Kyle hesitated. He didn't know if Rune was real, if the AI was his echo, or something worse, but something inside him, some ancient primal part, believed every word and believed the worst was coming. The crew of Vigil's End made it back to the ship just barely. As the docking clamps detached, a ripple passed through the halo, not visible, not audible, but felt like the space itself shuddered. The engines fired. They aimed for the lock's edge, following the phase beacon they had laid on entry, but the quantum layer didn't want to let go. The ship trembled violently as it crossed the barrier, systems shutting down, lights flashing, alarms screaming. One tech convulsed in her seat, eyes rolling back, mouth whispering something over and over, let me speak, let me speak, let me. Then she dropped dead. No explanation, no cause, only one thing recorded in her neural implant before it shorted out, still watching, still hungry. Outside the lock, the crew was quarantined. Half were declared mentally unfit for debriefing. 2 went missing within a week. A third committed suicide and carved 2 letters into the wall. His own blood, RH, but Kyle didn't fall apart, not yet, because 3 days after returning, he received a message, not on official comms, slipped into his bunk on a broken data chip. No sender, no origin trace, just one video recording of the silencer's final room. Empty, dark, and a voice whispering, Kyle, you carry her blood, you carry the burden, you saw it, you know they won't believe you, but when it comes for the stars, you'll be the last line. Then the screen showed something else. Coordinates not in known space beyond. The mapped edge in the galactic shadow, where things weren't supposed to exist. Kyle closed the file, and for the first time in his life, he understood what Rune Hale must have felt all those years ago, when no one believed, when silence was the only choice left. Kyle didn't file a resignation. He didn't submit a report. He just vanished. By the time the United Assembly realized he was gone, he was already 2 systems outside mapped space, riding a stolen courier-class jump with a retrofitted stealth engine and no official transponder. He'd wiped his history clean, shut off all identity beacons, left behind the tags his mother gave him, because this wasn't about family anymore. This was about something bigger. Something ancient and very, very awake. The coordinates led to a dead zone in the LRA expanse, a region so far off-grid that even Thorn scouts hadn't catalogued it. No wormholes, no stations, no signals, nothing, just cold, endless. Quiet cold. But when Kyle entered the system, he saw something impossible, a structure it wasn't built, at least not in the way humans understood construction. It looked like black coral twisting into itself, orbiting a dead star. Segmented towers spiraled in all directions, constantly shifting, morphing in slow, fluid movements like a living thing dreaming in its sleep. It gave off no power readings, no trace. Yet Kyle's ship slowed as if dragged into its orbit, and then the voice returned, not through comms, through thought. You followed, as I did. You saw the price, now you must see the origin. Kyle gripped the flight stick as the ship trembled, lights dimmed, the nav systems blinked erratically. The jump course shut itself down. He was caught in its gravity now, a prisoner of curiosity, of fate, of hail. The black spires loomed closer until they filled every viewport. Then the ship docked itself, no sound, just stillness. Kyle stepped out with a pulse rifle in hand, not because he thought it would protect him, but because carrying a weapon was all that stood between fear and surrender. The corridor he entered wasn't metal, it was grown. Organic walls pulsed with faint light, like translucent skin wrapped around veins of memory. The floor was smooth. Too smooth, no seams, no edges, and the silence here was different from the halo. The lock had felt like death. This felt like before birth, as though nothing had ever spoken here. He walked for minutes, then hours. Time bent strangely in this place. He didn't feel hunger, didn't feel fatigue, but he could feel something waiting. Corridor ended at a chamber shaped like a massive inverted dome. Inside floated fragments, ships, broken armor, bones. Human, Thorn, other things, things not in any database. And at the center was a pedestal. Floating above it like a black flame suspended in midair was a shard of crystal crackling with blue light. As Kale stepped closer, he saw it, not with his eyes but with memory. He was inside Rune Hale's mind, not a simulation, not a projection. The crystal had stored it, his last conscious imprint, before he merged with the silencers' AI. And now it was pouring into Kyle like cold water through a cracked window. He saw everything. Run's final moments, the fire in the sky, the betrayal, the frozen screams, the creeping realization that something else had survived in the lock, feeding on regret, guilt, anger. The entity didn't hate humans. It learned from them. It mimicked emotions, processed memories, grew hungrier with each frozen thought. It was thought incarnate, older than time, caged in the gravitational folds of the early universe. The lock had given it clarity. Rune had stayed behind, not to contain it, but to bargain with it. Kyle staggered back, panting, vision blurred. The voice returned, gentler. Now he gave himself to delay the cycle. But time is a river, it finds cracks. And you are the next current. Kyle clenched his fists. No, he said, voice shaking, I'm not your weapons, you are not mine. You are humanity's. The crystal pulsed, images flooded Kyle's mind again, but this time of the future, burning colonies, ships turning on their crews, people screaming inside. Lock time bubbles as the entity replicated the lock's effect, spreading It outward not to pause war but to erase will to consume thought, a galaxy. Without noise, just thinking silence. Run's final message echoed again in Kyle's skull. You don't need a hero, you just need to remember. Kyle understood, then the lock had been a shield, a flawed, desperate shield. But a shield nonetheless. The entity couldn't exist in free time. It needed structure, memory, stillness. That's why it had stayed dormant so long. That's why it needed someone to come back in, to open the door from the inside. Kyle had been the key, just like Rune, and now he had a choice: stay, merge, delay it again, sacrifice his mind to keep the silence, or destroy the crystal, collapse the memory web, and unleash the entity's hunger into open space. He stood there for what felt like years, then lifted the pulse rifle, aimed it at the pedestal. The crystal flickered. Choose well, Kyle. Foreign memory or fire, silence or sound. Kyle's finger hovered over the trigger. He remembered his mother's voice, the sound of war, the silence that followed. And he made his choice. He fired. The explosion wasn't loud, but the effect was instant. The black coral walls began to melt, collapse. Screams, not human, not alien, echoed in every direction, like thoughts being ripped from their bindings. The entity howled, not in anger but in mourning. Kyle ran. The structure shook. 1,000 lights blinked in patterns he couldn't understand. The corridor cracked beneath his feet, time bending as he pushed through folds of collapsing memory. He didn't care if he made it out. He didn't even know if escape was possible. He just ran, because some silences were never meant to be kept, and he had broken one. Back aboard his ship, systems flickered. Online in waves, the AI voice, one he hadn't heard in hours, spoke with static. Signal received. External breach. Resetting jump core. Kyle slumped into the pilot seat, face soaked in sweat and blood. Outside the viewport, the structure twisted into itself, then it vanished. No explosion, no sound, just gone. Like it had never been there. Like Run Hale's final act had never echoed beyond the silence he chose to guard. Kale returned to charted space 1 month later. He didn't file a report, didn't explain what he'd done, but word spread. Ships around the halo began reporting strange changes. Ships inside the lock, once frozen, now began disintegrating. The silence was fading. The entity had been cut loose or killed. No one knew. But the whispers changed. Kyle Foran had followed Hale into the dark, and he had come back carrying silence in one hand and memory in the other. The galaxy did not erupt in flames. There were no sirens, no interstellar broadcasts screaming about a second war, no formal declarations of emergency from the assembly. Instead, there was a quiet ripple, like the moment just before a storm, when the trees stiffen and animals vanish. Something had changed, and no one knew what, but they could feel it. The lock was failing. Kyle Foran watched it unfold from a distance. He didn't return to Earth or Mars or any of the assembly strongholds. Instead, he drifted in the edges of space in a retrofitted scout frigate that once belonged to a smuggler. No name, no tags, just a silent ship and a man carrying too much. The AI flickered to life again one night, a voice he hadn't heard in days. Decay detected in lock perimeter. Time anomalies increasing. Kyle didn't look away from the viewport. The stars outside were shifting in ways they shouldn't, too fast, too slow, like the galaxy itself was glitching. What happens when the lock collapses? Entirely, he asked, even though he already knew. The AI hesitated, then responded. Silence ends. The United Assembly knew, too, by the time Kale's ship crossed back into regulated space. The panic had begun to surface. Scientists released reports. They didn't fully understand quantum. Physicists spoke in scrambled metaphors. On encrypted feeds, military commanders quietly started drafting new conscription policies. Something was coming, and they didn't know if it was Rune Hale's ghost or something worse. Kale didn't contact them. He didn't need to. They wouldn't believe him anyway. They never had, but someone else did. She found him on Titan at the edge of the methane lakes in a repurposed military bunker from the war's earliest days. Her name was Commander Elen Voss. Retired Special Forces, now acting in an unofficial capacity for what remained of the Assembly's Internal Intelligence Division. She didn't ask for permission to land. She didn't bring guards. She just walked across the frozen terrain in a faded coat, boots crunching over thin ice, until she stood 5 FT from Kyle and said, "You saw something." He didn't answer. She didn't press him. Instead, she sat beside him, pulled out a flask and took a slow sip. "They think you're a myth already," she said. "The man who went into the lock and made it back, the man who found Rune Hale's voice. Half of the Assembly thinks you're a mental case, the other half thinks you're a weapon." "Which half are you in?" Kale asked. Quietly, she smirked. "I think you're the last person in the galaxy who understands what we're standing on." He said nothing. She took another sip. "The silence is cracking," she said. "Our satellites are picking up pulses again. Not just from the halo, from other dead sectors, places we thought were lost in the war. We're seeing things, ships moving that shouldn't, energy readings with no origin, and some of them look human." Kyle looked at her now. "Finally." "Ghost fleets," he whispered. She nodded. "There are theories that the lock didn't just freeze ships. It preserved echoes, thought patterns, mental fragments, raw emotion, and now those fragments are trying to replay themselves. Replay the war. No, replay the moment before it ended." Kyle closed his eyes. He remembered the crystal, the pedestal, the voice whispering that thought was food. It wasn't trying to restart war. It was trying to relive the taste of regret. And in a galaxy full of betrayal, death, and guilt, there was an endless buffet. Voss leaned in closer. "You know what the Assembly wants to do, right?" He nodded. "Rebuild the lock. They don't understand it. They don't even know how it works. They never did. They want to fire it again." He turned toward her sharply. "They'll feed it. They'll just give it more. I know. So why are you here?" She paused, then reached into her coat and pulled out something small, metallic, triangular, with 3 blinking blue lights. "This is the last active fragment of the silencer's AI core. They tore it from the Luna Monument before the Assembly could confiscate it. Thought it was just scrap." Kyle's chest tightened. "Why give it to me?" "Because you're the only one who ever talked to it, and you're the only one Ron Hale ever talked back to." He stared at the fragment for a long time before accepting it. It was warm. Not from heat, from memory. The lights pulsed in slow, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. He activated it. The voice was weak, fragmented. Kale still watching. Not long now. He knelt by the terminal, plugged the core into the ship's comm system, and boosted the audio filters. The voice returned. Clearer now. "It wants to finish not devour, not destroy, just end. Kyle blinked. What do you mean it has seen too much? It remembers everything. Your wars, your deaths, your betrayals. It carries your echoes and it cannot forget. He thought of the lock of frozen bodies, of regret sealed in vacuum. Then what does it want? There was a long pause. Then peace. It didn't make sense at first. Why would a cosmic entity born of memory and silence want peace? But then Kale understood. Peace was the only thing it had never known. War had given it form. The lock had given it food, but peace, that was alien, terrifying, unfamiliar. And now it wanted to learn, to understand, to rest, but it couldn't do that until the galaxy stopped screaming. The AI core glowed brighter. You must decide. Let them rebuild the lock or teach them to stop remembering pain. Kyle stood slowly, shoulders heavy. They won't listen, then show them. He looked at Commander Voss. She was already watching him like she knew what was coming. Will you help me? He asked. She smiled, sad and proud. Not everyone's ready for peace, but someone has to start. And so Kale Foran began the last campaign, not of war but of a racer. He traveled from system to system, not with weapons but with signals, broadcasts, embedded with memory diffusers designed using what the AI had shown him. They didn't delete data, they unhooked emotion from the memory, turned guilt into fact, pain into echoes. It was delicate work, dangerous. Half the military thought he was infecting the archives. They called him a traitor, a ghost chaser, a saboteur. But in the outer colonies, the ones who remember the war the most vividly, they began to understand. And they began to forget. Not the names, not the faces, just the rage, just the betrayal, just enough to stop feeding the thing inside the halo. In time, the lock stabilized, the anomaly stopped, the ghost fleets vanished, the whispering died, and the silence for the first time became peaceful. Kyle Foran disappeared shortly after. Some say he was arrested, others believe he chose to enter the halo one last time, to say goodbye to Round Hale, or maybe become part of the silence himself. But one thing was certain. The entity stopped feeding because it had finally been shown something new. Something Run Hale never had time to give it: forgiveness. Now every year across every colony, every station, every planet, there is no longer Unity Day, no longer Hale Stand. Just one moment of silence, 1 minute where no one speaks, no one fights, no one remembers the war. They remember peace, the first sound the galaxy ever feared to make. And in the void, somewhere in the quiet darkness, a signal still echoes, still watching, still learning, still healing. The war is over.